Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stephan podcast, brought to you by Bold, the place to buy, save, and store your Bitcoin in your own 2 of 3 multi-sig over at getbold.io. That's for the American listeners. Now, joining me today is Tom Nelson, and he's known for his work in the climate world, and I know you are also the producer of this movie, Climate the Movie. So we're going to get into all of that. But first of all, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you doing this. Thank you.
So let's start. I think one thing you're known for talking about is this idea that carbon is not the temperature knob. So I think that's probably a key point to maybe start on there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the critical point, I think, of the whole thing, that we have this whole $50 trillion possibly scam based on the idea that carbon dioxide, or CO2, is the climate control knob. And if we just add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, then the planet's going to get warmer and bad things are going to happen. But that is not true at all. That is just one of maybe thousands of factors. So the whole idea that we can control Earth's climate by emitting CO2, it's just not true at all. It's amazing this whole thing has lasted for decades and so many people believe it. But it's not true. There's no evidence whatsoever. It's one of many, many factors.
Of course, yeah, and I'm sure we're gonna dive into various aspects of this also. But I think what we've seen is just decades of this kind of catastrophism, like of people saying, "Oh no, by this decade, this island is going to be underwater, or this, the polar bears, or and every decade, and you could argue as well. I know there was a recent or sort of recent one where I think everyone's favorite climate activist Greta Thunberg came out saying, "Oh, if it's not by this date, it's all over," and then that date actually passed, and it was sort of really awkward. But what's driving some of this catastrophism, this kind of extreme alarmism?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. I do think one huge part of it is just simple groupthink. I think there are a bunch of people who are going to work every day thinking they're saving the planet. They actually believe CO2 is the climate control knob. They think the weather is getting worse, and more people are dying now than they were in the past for weather disasters. They think of all sorts of things that are not true. They just think someone else has already proven it, and they can think of themselves as a hero because they're fighting against the people who don't believe. So I think groupthink is a big part of it, but power and control is also another huge part of it, because I think, as Richard Lindzen says, that if you can control carbon, you can control life. You can control everything we do. You can control how much meat we eat and how much we fly and what car we drive and how we heat our house, all that stuff. You can control everything about us if you can convince people that CO2 is like the most important thing ever, and we have to clamp down on people to save human civilization. So it's power, control, and groupthink. It's a combination.
Yeah, and so let's try to put this in context as I know you do in the movie, and I will just say for listeners, obviously I'll put the link in the show notes, climatethemovie.net. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great movie. But if you want to maybe explain in your words, where did this kind of recent round of climate catastrophism, or whatever, climate scam, whatever we're calling it, how did this kind of recent round of it evolve, and what would you say has been the public perception over that time?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back a long way to maybe to the 1950s or 60s. There's a guy who's been on my podcast a couple times, Jakob Nordengård, and he talks about the Rockefellers were involved and Maurice Strong and the UN, and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but they really were, I think, looking for some sort of problem that they could use to control us all. And I think they seized on maybe CO2 or a climate change as some sort of a global problem that they needed to control us. So that scare went off and on for quite a while. And to me, I started looking at it most carefully when Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out in around 2006 or 2007.
Or so?
Yeah. So you can look at Google searches and news searches and see that there was a huge peak of hysteria around then, because I talked to a lot of people, even people who are skeptics now, that said, I watched that movie and I thought, wow, this really is the biggest problem ever. And so it was effective propaganda, but all sorts of things he said in that movie were, of course, a complete crock. He scared us about polar bears and 20 feet of sea level rise and additional hurricanes, whatever. The whole thing, and the whole scare is complete propaganda, because none of the stuff that is supposed to scare us, none of it, 0% of it is true. So, so there was a peak of hysteria then, and I think, the COP meetings, the the yearly climate meetings have, I think, around number 29 now. It's been going on in the end of the year for that many years. And I think it has peaked now as we look at it more and more because people are figuring out the lies of COVID. So I don't know how much I can say on this stream without getting you in trouble, but people have figured out that there's the alleged experts have lied to us about so many things. And I've talked to tons of people who woke up because of that, and they started looking at climate because they found out we were being lied to about our health. And that makes me happy. I think the elites went for the Great Reset, and they got the Great Awakening. I'm seeing that all the time, and I'm loving it. I'm totally loving it.
I'm with you there. And I think for me, it's one of those things where, like, I was, anti the climate scam. I've been anti the climate scam for a while myself. And when all the COVID tyranny was happening, I saw so many parallels. It was almost the same kind of, there was so many parallels of like, oh, we've got this special model, but you little plebs, you're not allowed to look at it. You're not allowed to challenge it. And because of our special model and the world doesn't align with our little model, we need to do XYZ social control, economic control, and all these kinds of aspects of controlling people. And the parallels are almost perfect.
Yeah, definitely the blind faith in alleged experts and blind faith in models. You're not supposed to believe anything you see or hear yourself. You have to outsource your thinking to somebody else. And I'm so happy that tons of people are not doing that anymore. Because if you do any sort of sanity checking on this climate scam, like I keep saying, if you're an ordinary person, you have access to Google, you can go down any one of these rabbit holes for yourself. You don't have to be a climatologist to figure out the polar bears are doing fine and the hurricanes aren't getting worse and cyclones and droughts and floods. That's part of the reason I like to do this so much myself, is that it's so easy to do. It's so easy to debunk this stuff.
Right, yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who've been talking about these kinds of things. Alex Epstein has also been talking about this kind of thing by zooming out and saying, well, actually, the number of climate-related deaths is, if you chart that out, it's going down. And, these elements of understanding that we need wealth, we need economic wealth, and we need cheap and reliable energy. And I think this is an important thing because right now, to the point earlier about all the propaganda and Al Gore and all these people, now it seems like, as you said, I agree with you that it's on the way down. It's kind of on the way out. Less people are believing it, especially now with the election of Trump. I think it's seen as Trump is like drill, baby, drill, and we don't need to worry about this scam. But I think the other element is, if you look around the world, you see this concept of net zero, which is, again, I view that as that's like a crucial plank of the climate scam. It seems like net zero is almost taken for granted. I'm curious, why is that? Do you just put that back to the same groupthink, or is it something else at play there?
No, I think it is groupthink. But this whole idea of treating CO2 as a pollutant is crazy, because in the air outside of our houses right now, there's maybe 425 parts per million CO2. And as we're talking here, we're emitting 40,000 parts per million CO2, or almost 100 times as much. But anyway, the whole idea that we're fighting it as a pollutant, I think it's like fighting water, or it's like fighting oxygen as a pollutant. It's amazing that this whole hysteria has gone on as long as it has. I talked to Richard Lindzen about it, and I think he said maybe in the maybe 20 years ago, he was already shocked that it went on this long. James Hansen actually spoke I think it was in front of a Senate hearing in 1988, and that was one thing even way before Al Gore came on the scene that kind of kicked off one round of climate hysteria. But anyway, it's amazing it's lasted this long, but as it is, it's crumbling right around us as we speak. I'm watching it every single day. I've been kind of looking at this every single day for close to 20 years myself with Google searches and stuff. And I'm seeing a lot of causes for optimism if you want sanity to return, because it's coming back.
I see it like so many big governments around the world, they just swallowed the propaganda, or they helped cause it with some of their research funding. So, but either way, whether they caused it or they swallowed the propaganda, they've just taken it for granted. Oh, the world needs to go to net zero. Therefore, and then kind of once you accept that premise, there's all these other little things that come out of it, right? So as an example, oh, well, EVs are automatically better than any ICE and internal combustion engine car. Or there's kind of this underlying premise that developers need to build their buildings with this kind of net zero sustainable, and they've managed to very much propagandize the term sustainable and sort of claim it as their own, right? Because otherwise we could sort of say, well, what's economically sustainable, right? The thing that is cheap and reliable and works, and but no, it seemed like if you talk about the word sustainability, that's used in the net zero and this kind of context. So what are some of the implications that you trace out from, once you accept this kind of net zero or carbon is the temperature knob idea, what are some of the insane ideas that follow?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because the list of completely insane things is just endless. It's unbelievable. One of them is, I've seen it multiple times in peer-reviewed papers, is that to fight CO2, we should have teams of people who cut down trees. That's what they do all the time, is cut down trees and they bury them. One of them says we should have teams, I think 200,000 teams, maybe it was 2 million people. That's all they do all day long, is they take their hydrocarbon-powered chainsaws and they cut down trees and they dig big holes and they bury trees. So because there's carbon in the wood and you want to put it back in the ground, so that's the justification. But there's so many insane things. I just emailed you, or I sent you this C40 cities thing, where It's been signed by a whole bunch of mayors. It's still online as of now, and it's totally crazy. They want to allow each of us to buy 3 pieces of clothing per year. And if you buy that 4th piece, you can't do it. You got to wait till next year to prevent bad weather.
That's ridiculous.
That's how nuts. And no dairy for us and no meat for us at all by 2030. That's their ambitious goal in just over 5 years. No meat and dairy. And the whole payback is supposed to be this prevents bad weather. But I keep saying we could spend $50 trillion. We can all go live in caves, never drive a real car, never eat meat again. We can do all that stuff, and we will see absolutely no measurable weather or climate benefit ever. It's all pain, and it's no gain at all. So, yeah, the amount of insanity is just off the charts. It's amazing.
I think in one sense, and part of this, I think, I guess the US election recently happened, so I'm kind of thinking about things in that context, but there's perhaps a sense in which people were, let's say these quote-unquote elite journalists, or let's say propagandists, were sort of writing in their ivory tower and they didn't feel the consequences of what they were saying. And I think this is a similar context, right? Because there are people and they're writing in their little journals, their little reports, 3 articles of clothing per year and cut the supply chain 75%, but they're not feeling it themselves. And as more and more real-world people are feeling the consequences of these things, whether that's Germany or Australia or other countries that are starting to see their energy prices rising because of all the renewable madness, people are feeling the real outcome. And I think that is what is driving some of a push towards reality. I'm curious how you're seeing that. Is it that the consequences of some of these policies are coming home to roost?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that it's so easy, like you say, to sit in your ivory tower and talk about doing all this stuff to prevent bad weather. But then when it actually hits home, when they actually try to take away your gas stove and they try to take away your real car, and if they actually try to ban you from eating meat when you want to eat meat, people are not going to stand for that. It's fun to talk about telling people not to eat meat, but they're going to eat meat if they want to, and they're not going to be able to prevent us from doing it. I think they had this whole dream of having a central bank digital currency, and maybe they still will be able to implement some of this, but they have this whole idea of being able to cut us off. They have control of our finances, and when we're shopping for groceries, they know how much meat we bought this month, and the transaction can't go through if we buy too much. That's the dream, but people are absolutely not going to stand for this. They shouldn't, and they won't. It's so crazy.
Yeah, so I'm curious because it seems to me that there's some people who do accept that. Now, of course, I don't, but when you talk to certain more people who are more willing to accept what their TV tells them, right? Like, or maybe certain people in Europe, let's say, not everyone in Europe, to be clear, but certain people, when I speak to them, I almost get this sense of they just kind of accept it and just go along. I'm curious, do you see that? Or maybe even in America, you see that as well?
I hear people giving lip service to it, but, when I go to the airport, it's absolutely packed with people. I think they're flying when they want to, and the people sometimes say, I've cut back on flying, but I didn't want to fly that much anyway because I was tired of it. It's just a standard excuse for everything. You can make up some virtue signaling excuse for doing whatever you wanted to do anyway. So this whole thing is a really odd cult. I call it a climate cult. It's a very odd cult because even the believers can't be bothered to behave as if they believe. Absolutely not. I look at all these
Right.
high-profile people. You look at Al Gore, for example. He's just the classic example. In his book, he says, I have his book, we're supposed to accomplish our long-haul travel using buses. So I'm thinking, okay, Al, when is the last time you did a long-haul bus trip to try to prevent bad weather? He also says we shouldn't use our dryer. Okay, it's convenient to use your dryer, but you should line dry your clothes. I mean, we used to do that in the old days because we didn't have a dryer. But now that we have a dryer, I'm not line drying my clothes, and Al isn't either. So people are going to take the convenient, they're going to use the modern conveniences, and there's no way they're going to let them those conveniences be taken away because we're trying to prevent bad weather in 2075. It's a dream for the elites to do this, but it cannot succeed.
Yeah, I definitely get that sense as well, because there's this sense of, okay, I'm sure you've seen this one as well. There was like that one where I think it was like some politician who took like a limo to the event, but then like a couple hundred meters out from the event, they got on the bike and then they rode the bike to the event to sort of virtue signal about, and then everyone's seen like these images of like Elizabeth Warren getting off the private jet, or Taylor Swift getting off, Taylor Swift flying around the world in her private jet, but at the same time virtue signaling about, climate this, climate whatever.
Yeah, those are constantly fun for me. It might have been Pete Buttigieg. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I think he was caught doing that. I think a lot of politicians have been caught doing that, where they'll ride the bike just for the cameras for 100 yards or something. But yeah, it's all about limos. And of course, when Biden travels around, I think they fly his motorcade over there, I think, and then he gets in the motorcade. If he goes to Europe, I think they fly his vehicles over there. And even when Obama was president, he was, he's scolding us about using too much fossil fuel, but he was taking his plane to Hawaii, his private plane to Hawaii. And they said it was so hot in his office that you could grow orchids in there. That was an actual quote from later on. So the whole idea, we're going to turn down our thermostat and be cold in the winter here, turn it down to 64 Fahrenheit. People just aren't doing that. People are happy to try to force other people to do it. John Kerry is happy to force other people to not fly, but he's got quotes about how what he's doing is so important that it's worth it for him to fly. So everybody has a carve-out for themselves. So again, nobody wants to go through any inconvenience for this because they don't truly believe it. I think people are willing to say they believe it, but the amount of people who actually believe this, who behave as if CO2 is going to kill their kids, it's almost nothing. It's so stupid that even they don't truly believe it, I think.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKite.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices, such as the ColdCard Mark IV and the new ColdCard Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now, you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck as a few examples. Now, you have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases, you can use seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. The lead sponsor of this show is Bold, the best place to buy, sell, and save Bitcoin. For listeners in the US, Bold lets you secure your financial future with complete peace of mind by integrating a low-fee, Bitcoin-only brokerage with next-gen multi-sig vaults. With Bold, you can smash buy Bitcoin or set a DCA plan for only 0.99% fees and seamlessly deposit the Bitcoin direct to your Bold Vault. The Bold Vault is a 2 or 3 collaborative multi-sig where you hold 2 keys and Bold holds 1 as a redundant backup, protecting against loss or theft. You can use Trezor, Ledger, or Coldcard hardware wallets to spin up a Bold Vault in just a few minutes, and the Bold Vault is the only collaborative custody vault available with 0 monthly fees. They're also offering 0 fees on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin buys and $25 of free Bitcoin when you buy $100 of Bitcoin or more. Try Bold today and upgrade your stacking experience over at getbold.io. And now, back to the show. Yeah, I mean, I mostly agree with you, but I would say there's definitely been examples where as an example, Australia was shutting down some of their coal plants. Meanwhile, Germany is also, was kind of cutting down some of their reliable energy. On the other hand, you got China, who's like setting up all these coal plants all the time. So is it just that some countries got more ideologically captured than others, or how can we explain that difference?
Yeah, I think that is a big part of it. I think there were videos of politicians in the UK who heroically were pushing the plunger to blow up coal plants, which is, of course, completely crazy. But I think they think coal plants are evil, and of course the lights are going to stay on. We don't have to worry about the lights staying on. All we have to do is maybe put in more electrical sockets, then we'll have more electricity or something. They don't understand at all how the grid works. So they think they can just they can run the whole thing on wind and solar. I think that's a very common misconception, that let's just get rid of all hydrocarbons. Let's just put up enough solar panels and wind turbines, and we can run the whole country. We can make our steel using this, and we can run our data centers. But this is all by people who don't actually understand how the real world works. The whole idea that if we had a blackout, trying to run it on wind and sun, so the answer is to put up more wind and sun, try to have more of that, that's going to fix it. People believe this, but when the rubber hits the road, it doesn't work. And people talk about how much is this green energy work, like a wind turbine, how much is that worth if the wind doesn't blow all the time? And I've heard talking about how much would you pay for a car that works only an unpredictable 1/3 of the time? It's kind of like that you want a real car that works when you're ready to go. And wind and sun is so intermittent, it can never power our society. We can't have enough batteries to power the U.S. economy and run it on wind and sun. There's some people believe, hey, let's just buy enough batteries, but that doesn't scale at all either. So there's a lot of craziness by people who they don't have an engineering background, or they don't have any sense of what real life, how real life works. They just don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I've seen is more like this tendency of more energy, just more of everything, right? The popular, I guess if you believe what the TV tells you, you would think, oh, we're shutting down the coal and we're shutting down natural gas and we're just doing wind and solar and maybe a little bit of hydro. That's kind of the perception that you would believe if you just believe what the TV tells you. But then if you zoom out and you look at the actual graph of like how much of what, it's just more of everything. It's more coal, more wind, more solar, more nuclear, more natural gas, and that's just the trend we've seen over time. And to be clear, it's like 80% of that is still fossil fuel or hydrocarbon energy. So it's not that we've been, whereas the TV would have us believe, oh, we're in the transition, and it's just kind of acknowledged or accepted that everybody agrees and you're a crazy conspiracy denier if you don't agree with the transition.
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything you just said there, that, the TV's telling us that the transition is happening, hooray. But like you said, looking at the real graph, it's still what's really powering us is hydrocarbons and nuclear power. I think that I'm a big fan of that. I think we should put up a lot more of that in the U.S. because right now, unless we invent something that I'm not aware of, I think that is what we're going to have to be using far in the future when we finally at some point do run out of hydrocarbons. I think nuclear is going to be the next thing up. It looks like to me.
Yeah, I agreed with you there. Let's get into the topic of science, funding, and I guess the culture that created this, because I think that is arguably also what's driven some of this. Now, we could say, the left kind of did this march through the institutions, and they've kind of got all these like climate Marxist types who kind of wanted more left aligning ideas. But in your documentary, you also get into this and talk a little bit about the funding. So can you explain a bit about how the funding situation has driven some of this outcome?
Yeah, there's this whole deal that we mentioned in the movie that funding for all kinds of things right now, when climate change was the hot thing, that if people were maybe doing butterfly research, they might not get any money for that, just for the butterfly research. But if you can say, I'm researching the effect of climate change on butterflies, then you get the funding. And I think this was repeated over and over thousands and thousands of times, that those are kind of the magic words. You put those magic words in there, you can get funding. And people were rewarded for putting climate change in there. So I think a huge portion of climate change funding, whatever, was just put in there just to get the funding. And if you wanted to research anything on the skeptical side, the skeptical scientists, you can't get funding nearly as easily. The Willie Soons of the world, they're not drowning in funding because what they're finding is the truth, and it goes against this whole bogus climate change narrative. So I think we really need to reverse this and find out what really drives Earth's climate. I mean, I've done 260 podcasts now, and there's tons of people that are talking about what really is causing the climate to change. Because for sure, it's changing all the time. But it's so complicated that we don't know exactly why. There's so many factors. So I think we should figure out what's actually going on. I think it's a good area to research. But this whole idea that we should focus everything on CO2 as a climate control knob and the fight against CO2, it's completely crazy, and so much capital and so much brain power has been expended on this stupid idea, this incorrect idea that CO2 might kill us all. It's amazing.
I wonder as well, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but it could be that sometimes people want to argue about things that they can easily understand. And if something's really complex, they're not as able to sort of argue about some nuanced thing because they don't know about that. And so maybe that's kind of, people just want to argue about CO2 because that's been branded, or it's been presented, it's been put in front of us on our TVs. This is the knob, and you better argue about that.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that we're told, our TV tells us that climate science is basic physics. It's so easy that the grade schoolers get it. And you're evil if you don't go along with this basic physics. But then in the movie, we have John Clauser, who won the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics. So it's supposed to be basic physics, but yet this Nobel Prize winner doesn't get it. I mean, of course it's not basic physics. It's so many orders of magnitude more complicated than basic physics. So, yeah, just every single part of this, again, every single part of the alarmist narrative, if you look at it carefully, it's all bogus. 100% of it is. And I wanted to bring up this whole thing, and maybe you're about Bitcoin mining causing bad weather. I was just watching some of the adopting the El Salvador thing. They were talking about there's kind of a thread going through there that Bitcoin doesn't cause a lot of bad weather. It emits CO2, and we know CO2 causes some bad weather, but doesn't cause a lot of it. There's that kind of thing. But anyway, I'd like to push back on that and say it doesn't cause any bad weather. Emitting CO2 doesn't make the weather worse at all. And arguably, it makes the weather a little bit better. That when the Earth is slightly warmer, it's been good times to be on Earth. And if CO2 makes the Earth a little warmer, and it for sure makes the crops grow better, makes the crops grow way better. And we have more global leaf area on Earth. It's helping the corn grow better. So anyway, CO2 makes our life a little better. Additional CO2 makes it better. So the whole idea that we have to be guilty about Bitcoin mining because maybe we emit some CO2, we should not be guilty at all, because it doesn't make our lives worse. It makes our life better in so many ways.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, Tom. And I would put that down to, even inside of Bitcoin circles, you've got more left-aligned Bitcoiners and more right-aligned Bitcoiners, right? So I'll be honest, I'm more of a right-wing libertarian, so I'm more, skeptic of the climate scam, let's say, whereas more left-aligning Bitcoiners, they sort of buy into that narrative, and so they're trying to sort of appease, and that's their frame of mind. So they're sort of like, oh, yeah, because obviously they've accepted, the propaganda, carbon is the temperature knob, therefore I want to try to demonstrate why Bitcoin mining is sustainable in their terms. So I think that's part of what's driving that. And then also, as I'm sure you're well aware, there's the whole ESG. Now, ESG has obviously, taken a lot of criticism in recent years, but, at least up until very recently, you needed to tick that box. And if you wanted to be able to seek capital from various people, whether you were trying to get funding for your Bitcoin mining startup or for your, various ventures, you sort of needed to be able to tick that box. So I think that was why the more left-aligned Bitcoiners were going down that way. Now, I personally, there are times where I might sort of be talking to someone and say, look, even on your own terms, like if you thought, even if I granted you that CO2 was the carbon, was the temperature knob, you'd still, it's still, even on your own terms, you should still be a fan of Bitcoin mining. But of course, my overall position is, no, I don't believe CO2 is the temperature knob personally. But that's just political differences in, even inside the camp of Bitcoiners, I would say.
One thing that encourages me is that if there are people that are buying into the climate crisis thing in the Bitcoin community, that they can be brought over to the other side, I think. People like Michael Mann who have gone all in, he's pushed all of his chips in on it. I don't think people like that are ever going to admit that they were wrong because it's just way too painful. I think there's a ton of people who haven't pushed all their chips in, and those people, I think so many of them can still be reached. Tons of people who I know that are well-known climate skeptics now, they believed it in the past. They believed pretty seriously possibly in the past. Anthony Watts is one. I believed it myself. I didn't climate march or anything, but when I first heard about this, I thought, well, I was a normie back then, and I thought the scientists, they're smart and they approve this. So I bought into it for a while. But I'm seeing a lot of people that say, I used to believe, but I looked into it for myself, and now I don't. And that's the wonderful thing about this is that you can pick any one lie. You can just start, when you're talking to people, just start with a polar bear lie or whatever they bring up. You can start down any one little rabbit hole. You can show them whatever they told you was a complete lie. And then I think that opens up a crack, and then they're more, they will listen to you more as you would go down more rabbit holes with them. You have to just realize that they're lying to us everywhere, and you can start with just one lie and then expand it.
Yeah, I think that's really true, because it's like once you realize, wait, they were lying to me about this one thing. Yep. Okay, what else were they lying about? Or can I even take these people seriously, right? And I think we are arguably in the last year or two, I think we've seen a big social and cultural shift, right? I think we've started to see the power of I'm going to call them legacy media now instead of mainstream media. I think their power is starting to wane. Like the Joe Rogans and the Tucker Carlsons of the world with their massive podcasts are able to reach a lot of people. And so it's where people get their truth from is starting to change now. And I think now people are starting to be a little more willing as well to challenge some of these things. I'll tell you what, like even if you rewind the clock 10 years ago, it was, you were a massive outcast to sort of be against, the net zero and the carbon, all this stuff, right?
Yeah. And
nowadays, I would say, and I'm curious what you think as well, I've seen a lot more people using the term climate scammer, right? Like I've been using that, but I'm noticing other people are starting to use it more, right?
I think I was just looking, there was an actual study from the other side about they're clutching their pearls because so many people are using the hashtag climate scam. We're using it. I love seeing that. But yeah, I've been online, I was on Blogspot for a while. I've been on Twitter since 2008. And there was a time when I felt a little bit more alone. There are always some active skeptics, but more and more, I'm definitely seeing it. It makes me so happy when there's a crazy claim put up on Twitter now that you go through the replies and I can find all kinds of people I've never heard of before that are saying this is wrong and this is why it's wrong. They're not just they're not just calling names or anything. They're debunking it using data and facts. There's so many people who have come up to speed on this through the alternate media. They're never going to learn about this stuff from CNN or whatever from watching their TV. They're not going to learn the truth about this that way. But people are learning from these podcasts. And like you said, I'm so happy that Rogan is a great example because he believed in this as of, I think, 2018. He interviewed Candace Owens and his mind was blown when she said she didn't believe in it. He couldn't believe it back then, but in the years since, he has switched over and now he's scoffing at it when it comes up. I don't know what his level of belief is, but quite commonly, I listen carefully, it'll come up and him and his guests will kind of scoff at it. So there's been a big change there. I love it.
So let's talk about some of the temperature record, right? Because this is going to be a common thing people, talk about. I think an interesting one I saw you talk about in the movie, in the documentary, was the urban heat island effect. So do you want to just explain a little bit about the temperature record and how to think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because I just had John Christie on my podcast yesterday, and he's one authority on this, looking very carefully at the data for many decades. And there's this whole issue of, we mentioned it in the movie, that in Paris, for example, on a warm day, it might be 5 degrees centigrade or more warmer in the center of town than it is on the outskirts because there's all the warm asphalt and there's cars putting out heat and all. There's a lot of ways that humans make the make the temperature warmer without the CO2 being involved. So that is a big problem because there's been a lot of, maybe most weather stations in the U.S. or anywhere else, they started out in a rural area surrounded by grass, and just very slowly over time, the town tends to move out towards the station, and eventually there's buildings around there, and there might be airport tarmac or all kinds of ways that the temperature that you're reading is warmer than it would have been. Nothing to do with CO2. It's just because the urban heat island is causing more warmth, especially at night. Because if it's warmer during the day and all that asphalt gets warm, it does not cool down completely overnight for quite some time. So it is a huge factor. And John Christie on my pod just yesterday argued that that's a far bigger factor than CO2 in nighttime temperatures getting warmer. It's just merely, it's not CO2, it's other factors. And he's done a good job. John Christie's looked at that. Willie Soon has looked at it very carefully. Anthony Watts has done a tremendously good job on this from What's Up with that. He's actually had people go around to the stations, and he has all these pictures of official weather stations that are right by tarmac, or they're right by a parking lot with hot engines parked right next to it, or near a Weber grill, or near a AC outlet. There's all sorts of ways that heat's being pumped right over the sensors. And again, you might think, oh no, it's warmer now than it was 100 years ago, but those heat sources weren't there 100 years ago. So it's a huge factor.
This show brought to you by Mempool.space, the world's leading Bitcoin visualizer. And now they've got an accelerator program. So if you have a transaction that you sent at a fee that was too low to get confirmed, now you can fix this with the Mempool accelerator. The way it works, you can go and search your transaction, scroll down, click accelerator, and you don't need an account. You can pay with Lightning, and then it'll show you it's now in the process of being accelerated, and then after a few minutes, it's confirmed. And so this is a great way to help you out if you are stuck. And this can happen where maybe your wallet doesn't have RBF or CPFP, or it might help you in situations where it's impractical to go and re-sign. So for example, multi-sig with keys in different locations. And thirdly, even in some Lightning scenarios, perhaps a forced close, you might not be able to use RBF. And so in this case, the Mempool accelerator can help you out. So keep it in mind, and you can find out more over at mempool.space/accelerator. Right, so it's like an artificial raising of the temperature. Yes. And as I recall, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I recall, part of what's driven that rise in the temperature record, or at least the fake temperature record, let's call it, is that the lows have been raised, right? It's like because the lower temperatures have been raised, that's raised the average.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Just while we were talking about this, I don't want to forget this thing that happened about 40 degrees centigrade being hit in the UK. There was a lot of publicity about, oh no, it hit 40 degrees, humans caused it because of CO2. But Chris Morrison checked into it, doing some great journalism. He found out that 40-degree record was near an active airport landing strip, and jets were landing there right at that time, and it only lasted for 1 minute. The temperature went up by 0.6, I think, and down by 0.6 within a minute. It was just like a breath of warm air went over the sensor, so people were freaking out about this, but it had nothing to do with CO2. And it also had something to do with the temperature sensors we're using now. I had someone else on my podcast, it may have been Anthony Watts, talking about how we used to have more simple thermometers, and back in the day, if a warm blast of wind went over a thermometer, it wouldn't even get captured. But right now, we have very sensitive instruments, and if there's a spike, it can capture that spike. So again, we can freak out about things that have nothing to do with CO2, and the whole idea that we should panic about these small temperature changes anyways, it doesn't make sense at all, of course.
Yeah. And as I understand, there's also been people trying to, let's say, confirm it through other means, right? Like rural data, balloons, and satellite data, and things like that. Can you comment a bit on that?
Yeah, again, John Christie on my pod yesterday, he is in charge of the UAH satellite data set. And I think that is our single best data set because they're using satellites and it's not affected by the Weber grills and the tarmac and all this other stuff. And his data shows way less warming than this other land data that's contaminated by the urban heat island effect. And But that data set starts in the 1970s, and it was cold in the 1970s. It was warm around the 30s and 40s, I think, globally. And then, for whatever reason, it cooled for decades. And there was a global cooling scare where Leonard Nimoy was talking about it. And you may have seen that on In Search Of, that what are we going to do if it keeps cooling like this? It's going to have a terrible effect on our crops, et cetera. So anyway, it did cool quite a bit during that 3-decade period. I forget where I was going with this. Where was I going with this?
Oh, I was just talking about using different types of records to confirm or
different types of records. Yeah, the satellite data is the best data, but there are all sorts of other type of records too. Going back we can just look at where the tree lines were. Actually, that's another big thing that we should be looking at. We can tell that the tree line just 4,000 years ago was quite a bit further north in the northern hemisphere than it is now. So there's a lot of evidence that just in the last few thousand years, it's been quite a bit warmer globally than it is right now. In the medieval warm period, there's tons of studies about that, where that was maybe 1,000 years ago or so. It was warmer then. And we're being told that CO2 was kind of stable all this time. So there's a lot of different ways to try to figure out how warm it was in the past. And none of them support the idea that CO2 is the reason for these fluctuations. The climate keeps changing on all different time scales. Some warmists think it's just on Milankovitch scales, and that maybe for 100,000-year periods, it just goes up very slowly and down very slowly, and that's it. But there's fluctuations on many different time scales. And sometimes there's different cycles. Sometimes the cycles line up, and then it gets really warm if they all line up in the correct way. Sometimes they line up the other way, and it gets really cold. It's incredibly complicated. We can't predict exactly we for sure can't predict what's going to happen next, because these cycles are not perfect cycles. But the whole idea that we should expect the climate to just stay the same, and if it changes, we caused it, that basic assumption is a complete crock, and we got to get rid of that one.
And so then on the extreme weather events, right? So this is another thing we see. It almost seems like as soon as there's anything that happens, the climate scammers, they just latch onto that and say, oh, see, it's because of climate change, it's CO2, see, it's proof that we're right. What's the truth there?
Yeah, I see that all the time. And the truth is that there's been bad weather in every single year of human history, as far as we know, a lot of it. So the whole idea that bad weather is evidence that CO2 causes bad weather, we see that all the time. Look at how bad this flood was, or look, this storm was really bad. But that doesn't prove anything. And the best person to follow to learn about this is Tony Heller, or Tony Climate. He is fantastic. Looking at because if you look at old newspapers, if you look at books and all kinds of records, you can constantly see people complaining about their mind is blown at how bad the weather just was. So if you look carefully at the data, and I've looked at it every which way for years, there's no signal at all if the weather is getting worse. And again, it looks like the weather might be getting slightly better. There's this whole idea that the warmth we've seen right now is making a slight lesser difference between the equator and the poles. So since there's less of a temperature difference there, there's a little less extreme weather. I wouldn't bank on that, but if there's big differences in temperatures and there's a clash between temperatures, that can cause storms. And the less the difference you get, possibly the less severe the storms are. But the bottom line is there's nothing. You can look anywhere you want. There's no evidence that CO2 is making the weather worse. It's just the CO2, the weather is not even getting worse. We're not even to the point where a lot of people think, okay, the weather is getting worse, but CO2 isn't the reason. But it's not even that case. It's that the weather is not getting worse. So we don't have to worry about the cause. The weather is not getting worse, for sure. And the IPCC agrees with that. Yeah. They talk about flooding, and they say in the IPCC that we don't even know the sign of any global change in flooding. They say, well, we don't know if it's getting more or less. We don't know the sign of it. So again, nothing to worry about.
So I guess you could say it's within the range of normal expected. Yeah. And so I think what people are getting, people are not understanding at times is that there's kind of a natural variability, and because by instantly latching on to something and saying, oh, it's because of climate, they're not understanding that actually it could have been explained by natural variability. That's kind of the short
absolutely.
answer, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's supposed to be this whole idea that the climate scientists today are so smart that they understand natural variability, and they're modeling that, and they've thrown that part out, and then they know that what's left over is caused by humans. But that part is wrong, too. We 100% don't know how to model the natural climate. You can claim that, but we don't know. Nobody really knows what it's going to do in the next 20 years. We can guess and constant surprises because it's so complicated. As I say, it's hard to model even a roulette wheel about where that ball is going to go. You figure out ahead of time and to figure out where that's going to go. Modeling Earth's climate is just many orders of magnitude harder than that. And even if we knew about all the factors, what they do and how they interact, we don't even know the initial state of all those factors. Like right now, we can't set up our climate model, even if it was perfect. We don't know the initial states of everything, so we can get it started in the right way. It's so complicated, and we're still using Fortran, I think, for these climate models. They're Fortran models. The whole idea we're going to base our civilization on those being right is like basing our civilization on the COVID models being right, and of course, they were wildly wrong too. It's
right.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. When it comes to the whole propaganda, and I'm sure there's been, volleys back and forth. So I'm sure after your movie came out, I'm sure the various, propaganda pieces came back at you. What were they saying? Like, whether it's, I don't know, London School of Economics or whoever else, like what were they saying? And, what was the response like there?
Yeah, I have it up here. Our movie's supposed to be misinformation on Facebook and Instagram based on a check done by a writer and visual designer, editor Derek Burns, based on that guy. So we have Will Happer, we have all these people that have looked at climate that are incredibly smart and decorated, but Derek Burns says it's not correct, so therefore it's misinformation. But yeah, it's just kind of a standard thing that these attempts at debunking us say we're wrong because we don't agree with what the TV told them. That's basically it. They don't go into detail and say, here's how we know CO2 is the climate control knob. Here's how we know that the weather is getting worse, blah, blah, blah. They never do that. There's no scientific papers that prove any of this stuff. Constantly, when I'm arguing with warmists, I'm asking, okay, so which paper has the evidence that should prove to a rational person that CO2 is the climate control knob? Or which paper should prove that the weather's getting worse, blah, blah, blah. There's no papers that prove any of this stuff because none of this stuff is true. It's amazing.
So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on any debates, whether you've done them or any recent debates that have taken place. Do you have any hope that debates are going to help here, or is it just more like public opinion has to shift in some other way?
No, there has been some debates. There was one real debate, I think it was about 2007. There was an Intelligence Squared debate. That was a real debate that had 3 people on our side and 3 on their side, and the skeptics won that one. It was a high-profile, very well-done debate, and I think that kind of scared off the people on the alarmist side. There's tons of cases of them agreeing to do a debate and then backing out at the last minute.
Right,
but yeah,
classic.
I think I would love to see national debates, of course, hours-long national debates. And I think we win every time because the truth is on our side. There's been some minor debates. I've done a couple small ones on my podcast, and Tony Heller's been involved in some. I think Steve Koonin did one against Andrew Dessler, maybe, about net zero. There's been a few minor debates, but not major ones. I'd like to see them on actual CNN or on TV that the normies are watching. I would love to see that. But I think warmists are going to continue to duck debate because they're not confident that they can win them. They can't win them. Actually, Dave Collum just did a debate against Stephen Keen on Zero Hedge.
Oh, okay.
That's one.
Right.
It's about a 54-minute debate. Yeah, that just came out on Sunday, I think. That was a pretty good one, but pretty short. But Stephen Keen is talking about how crazy stuff like he doesn't think that humans might see 2050 because of CO2.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, again, that's a guy going all in on the models. Because if you're walking around outside and looking at the birds are singing, blah, 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 the whole idea that CO2 is going to kill us all by 2050, there's no freaking way that can happen. If you talk to anybody who works outside, for example, who has some connection to the real world, and ask them, do you think we're all going to be dead by 2050 because of carbon dioxide? I mean, if you have any connection to reality, you're not going to believe that. But if you're some sort of professor living in a modeled world, then maybe you could believe it.
Yeah. Okay. So look, let's talk a little bit. Now, you mentioned these COPs as like an annual conference. I know that's kind of one of the the meccas of this kind of thing. But to talk about the different, what are the main conferences or kind of ways that these kinds of things are being discussed, and are you seeing like a waning interest in them or a growing interest in them?
I'm seeing hopeful signs of waning interest. I forget the names, but I think Biden's not going, and I think the Macron's not going, and Argentina pulled out. And just from the outside, I'm seeing way less publicity. I'm old enough to remember that on Twitter, this was a big deal. I remember during the peak of Al Gore's popularity about climate, right after his movie, he was treated like a rock star. They kept saying rock star Al Gore showed up. But now I think the enthusiasm from the outside is way down. I'm hearing almost nothing about it. And I'm even hearing some people say maybe they're going to end. I don't know why they wouldn't end. But I think they have had tens of thousands of people still flying in. To go to this most recent one, I think you can't even get there overland. So it's incredibly ironic that all these people that are fighting hydrocarbons have to fly far away to Azerbaijan to go to this thing. So, yeah, I think there's less interest. I'm hopeful that they are going to completely stop happening. But again, so many people have their professional life is on the line here. This is their thing that they do. And they've spent their life talking at parties about how Trump is crazy for not believing in it. So I think it's very hard for them to back away and say, this is all a crock. I got to get a real job now. I don't know how that's going to play out for them, but we'll see.
Yeah, it might end up being similar to how, as an example, in the US, I see the sense is that the Democrats are kind of stepping a bit back from all the trans stuff, as an example, because they're sort of seeing how out there it was that like the average everyday American just didn't want to go with that, and so I think that might also play against them there. On the subsidies point, so I think this is another big kind of back and forth point. Now, I've seen this in the context where I was growing up in Australia and watching some of these debates as well, where people would sort of argue about how much subsidy wind and solar was getting, and then the response back would be like, oh no, see, fossil fuels is getting all this subsidy, but then you'd dig into it and then it would be like, no, actually they're miscounting like a tax rebate that would be available anyway as a subsidy, whereas like the wind and solar thing is actually a subsidy. But I'm curious, where do you see it in terms of government subsidies for the different forms of energy that are kind of a downstream consequence of your belief in the CO2 temperature knob?
I think what I saw is what you saw. I think that they were saying, oh, Chevron's getting these massive subsidies, but they were just calling it just standard accounting. They were saying that's a subsidy. They were depreciating their assets or whatever. They're calling that a subsidy, but it's accounting that was available, again, to every other form of company, fossil fuel or not. So, yeah, I've seen other estimates that fossil energy is undersubsidized by a factor of 100 or something compared to wind and sun. There's in my home state here of Minnesota, there's all kinds of subsidies for this crazy green energy. They're putting up solar panels here way north of the 45th parallel, and they're sitting there covered by snow. And the only reason that they're being put up is to farm the subsidies. It's not because the energy payback makes any sense at all. In fact, I had a guy in my podcast, Douglas Pollock, who said that in general, I think above the 30th parallel, it doesn't make sense to put up solar panels because over the life of the panel, you get back less energy than you spent in putting into it, in manufacturing it and doing all the mining and whatever. So yeah, subsidies have done just a lot of evil in terms of misallocation of capital. So I think we should take them all off and just let these energy sources compete on their own merits. The whole idea that we have to subsidize these crazy energy forms because we have to save human civilization, we got to get rid of that. And I'm hopeful with the new Trump administration. There was this whole idea under the Biden administration that we're going to kind of make climate change kind of the centerpiece of all the departments. They're going to kind of have a climate focus everywhere. I think we're seeing the other thing now, that as all these new nominees are coming out, I'm going to their Twitter feeds and saying, what are they looking at? What did they say about climate? And over, I'm seeing stuff that makes me happy about. They're saying that we're not believing in this. Maybe it's a scam. There's tons of unbelievers, it looks like, that are going to get into high positions in the new Trump administration. So that makes me happy, real happy.
Yeah, so I think ultimately it is the tide is turning. I think that's my perception of where things are going, kind of the public debate. And I think it was sort of like after, a few people have to kind of go out and take the slings and arrows, and maybe you probably were one of those guys taking the slings and arrows at the start. But now it's sort of clearing the pathway for more people to sort of say, yeah, actually, this kind of doesn't make sense to me. Let's just do the efficient thing instead of the quote unquote renewable thing. So I do think there's
I think there's a huge snowball effect that as people step forward, and then more and more people are encouraged to say, well, he or she said it, so it's okay for me to speak out too. I think we're actually seeing more and more people speaking out. It's not like you're treated like you're a horrible person as much as it used to be. An interesting case study was Martin Durkin, who I consider a friend now. I worked with him on this movie. He came out with the Great Global Warming Swindle, and he got so much pushback back then. And he was ready for that same amount of pushback this time with this movie. But it didn't really show up. That the mainstream media never did attack the movie. And I don't know if they wanted to maybe to ignore us and we would go away. But we were all braced for way more pushback than we actually got. So it's just a different world now than it was 15, 16 years ago.
Yeah, maybe that's almost a sign of, their kind of disinterest now is almost an indication that, oh, this is an acceptable viewpoint now. Whereas 15 years ago, it was not an acceptable viewpoint.
Yeah, that could well be. Yeah, I'm encouraged. I think I almost never hear people, I don't know if you do, in real life as you're walking around talking to people at parties and stuff, it almost never comes up. I usually don't bring it up, but it doesn't seem like it's at the front of anyone's mind or hardly anyone's mind.
I'll tell you what. So I would say not in my direct friend circles, but let's say my 1 degree of separation. I've had friends who tell me they have friends who are still kind of, let's say, climate leftist type believers. And so, I think it just really depends what circles you run in. Like, obviously, maybe guys like you and I, the circles that we run in, maybe we're just less likely to run into those people nowadays. But,
do you think that people are not having kids because they think the world's going to end by 2050? I don't want to bring my kid into this world, or they just not want they want to have kids anyway, and they're just using it as an excuse.
I think it's just kind of like a thing people say, and really the factors are other economic, social, cultural factors that are lowering fertility rates. So we'll see what happens there. I actually, on the kind of Bitcoin side of it, I think once we sort of get once people get to a Bitcoin standard, I actually think we're going to turn that around. We're going to bring fertility back because we're going to start fixing, to kind of, I see it in a kind of, there are these social and cultural problems of today that we need to fix those. But I guess I haven't asked you about Bitcoin. Are you a Bitcoin guy as well? You see any potential there? Are you a hodler?
I am a Bitcoin guy. Yeah, I absolutely am. Yeah. I don't know if you heard my origin story, but as a climate skeptic, I got invited to be on Safedean's podcast and Marty Bent's podcast a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And that is what kicked it off. And I listened to Safedean's book, and I started listening to tons of podcasts, and I've been to a couple of conferences now. So I'm kind of I'm pretty orange pilled. I'm very orange pilled right now.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I mean, definitely comes into that whole like CBDC kind of challenging angle as well, because there's kind of that angle of like, would your money be controlled, and would they stop you buying a certain amount of meat or whatever, or flying, or using your money to fly on a plane? Whereas obviously, if if we can sort of get people to use Bitcoin, then there's more of a sense of you can do what you want. It's your money. So hopefully that's the optimistic vision of the future. We'll see what exactly it turns out there. But I think we'll finish up here. But listeners, make sure you check it out. It's climatethemovie.net. All the links will be in the show notes, and you can follow Tom on x.com. The handle is Tom A. Nelson. So Tom, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you, Stephan. Appreciate it.